and afternoon, folks. This is Dr. Scalise coming to you on behalf of Well-Mannered Monsters. This is a revamp of my former show, C3, which I loved, and I kind of stopped that for a while. Had a new baby in the family and so forth, and I decided to dox myself, so here we are. This is the revamp of C3. A little different content emphasis, but we're still going to be producing the same quality. And this is Well-Mannered Monsters Podcast 1.1 with your co-host, Dr. Scalise. Discussion today is a little bit on DeSantis and Disney, and then obviously we'll get into the underlying metaphysical or worldview issues that always undergirds these narrative and broad discussions we're having in society, whether we know it or not. Now, what is really remarkable in many respects is that Jenna Ellis, and we're going to lead in with this, Jenna Ellis, who was an attorney for Donald Trump to try to fight the election steal, and she did a decent job, and went to all the different state legislatures, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, and she did a remarkable job. Now, obviously, Rudy Giuliani gets most of the credit because he was center stage there, but she actually went to school with me at Liberty University. I think I was a professor there when she was a student, but I'm not exactly sure on the timeline. I just know she was there. And she came out shortly after DeSantis made this move against Disney. And what was the nature of DeSantis's move? He simply removed a privileged tax status and self-governing rights that Disney had received back in the early to mid 70s. Through, I guess, a benevolent government agreement. I'm not really sure. I haven't looked into the history of it. But what I do know is that they had beneficial tax treatment and had a remarkable ability to govern themselves, which is quite frankly a bit strange to me. And maybe I just didn't know this, but that you would kind of have this two-tier, even corporation among the corporations. I mean, a corporation getting to be able to govern itself in a special tax district and so forth, like that's really remarkable. So obviously you could say there's a two-tier citizen model that also belies that, and I think that would be accurate. Now, DeSantis said he was going to go after them because they were producing woke CRT training within the organization, and that Disney doubled down, tripled down, hostilely said they were going to advance wokeism, and let's just say what it actually is, sexual confusion and mental illness, along with a great deal of shame. And obviously the end goal is that if you can tie sexuality to a child's identity at a very young age and tie that to a political party or ideology, then the child has a really hard time breaking out of that ever in their life. And if you don't know that, that's kind of there's some psychologists that demonstrated this, that if you can tie a child's sexuality before they've really formed it to a political party at a very young age, the child will nearly be a lifer for that political party. So understand that this is all still simply about gain and political power and a political accumulation. And is Disney pulling the strings there? I don't know, and it doesn't matter. But the point is that they came out and were glaringly in the face of all parents pretty much across this country, unless you're within that 5 to 15%, let's just say, liberal mental illness category, where it just doesn't matter what you're taught. You just have never learned to think critically. Perhaps you were the sexually abused one when you were young, in some measure by some sort of groomer. And so Disney basically said, we want to be groomers, and we want to promote a groomer culture with your kids. Your kids need to be sexually confused and messed up, mentally ill, and we're not going to back down. DeSantis said, okay, you want to go after the parents here in Florida because you're located here in Florida and you're at the center, your hub of power here is right there at the, let's call it the groomer kingdom going forward. Rather than the magic kingdom, it is the groomer kingdom. You want to go after them? That's fine. We're gonna go after you. Then we're gonna remove your privileged tax status along with your self-governing rights, and you're gonna become just like every normal corporation. You're not gonna have that additional power, that's what it is additional power. And Jenna Ellis, remarkably, to my mind, this seems radically just unthoughtful, but maybe I'm wrong. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer, but she came out with what I think is a kind of hostile towards DeSantis position that DeSantis overstepped his bounds and he's setting a precedent for government to be able to control and basically impose its will on corporations, and that this was a dangerous precedent that it was setting. And I found this really remarkable that she would take this position, because ultimately government, when it's working well, and obviously, is she a constitutional lawyer? I have no idea what she is. I mean, she was involved with Trump, and I don't know how she got involved with being one of Trump's attorneys, but there she was. But one of the, if you know the preamble to the Constitution, then you know that it's the will of the people that the representatives of Congress and state Congresses and state Senates, that they're designed to enact. So it's not necessarily when a government is working well, and maybe Jenna Ellis is hitting on the fact that much of at least the federal Congress and House of Representatives does not act as representatives of the people. They act as an aristocracy that does what they want, and the people be damned, so to speak. But more or less, though, at the state level, much as not all the states, but many of the states, especially the red states, which I'm thoroughly believing Florida right now is a red state. It's not a purple state anymore. But when it's acting as it should, it represents the will of the people, and it should enact the will of the people against corporations and any other entities that want to do something that's opposed to the will of the people. Obviously, this is a dangerous, when you start thinking through how exactly our government works, the dangerous proposition, what leads to the dissolution of America, the destabilization, the downfall of America, is a people who have become immoral and unspiritual. Because essentially, if the will of the people becomes as corrupt as the corporations and the government above it, then what you have is a monolith from the people through the corporations to the government of basically immorality that's going to be enacted because the people have become immoral. This is why George Washington, in his farewell address letter, famously stated that if the United States people ever became an immoral, and I believe he says irreligious people, that the Constitution would be their downfall. And that's simply because the Constitution will then go on to protect that type of evil behavior, as we've seen with, let's say, the claims of the transgender and LGBTQ plus movement, their claims that they should be treated like equal citizens. An easy argument to make there is that the Constitution would protect them, as it would protect any people in the United States saying that they want to enact their behavior. And you might say, well, should the government stop that? I think the government should legislate and stop that. I'm not even to me, I think you're trying to answer the question downstream at that point, which is why George Washington made this great prediction. Simply, if the people are a moral and religious, or moral and value-filled, virtuous people, then the question of what's legislatively possible, what's legislatively permissible, only goes into certain thresholds of acceptable behavior. So what that means is that if you're a moral and virtuous people, then you're not interested. Legislative questions such as protecting what I would call sexually deviant behavior isn't even going to get onto the docket for governmental involvement, because it's solved at the more basic, fundamental people and cultural level of basically their value systems and what they believe. So, this is one of the, and I'm not going to call it, it may be the Achilles heel of our nation's Constitution, and maybe this is why George Washington said what he said, but it is the great protection our Constitution offers to all, let's say, culturally accepted groups and classes. So if the culture will accept a group or a class, and the Constitution and the courts are going to follow that to a large degree, which is basically what we're seeing at this point. Of course, we could go back and historically say, well, the Constitution never assumed that the content of America's soul would be as corrupt as it presently is. And you could make that argument. It might very well be persuasive, but it wouldn't remove the long-standing, now for at least 50 years, problem of the value set of America moving away from traditional values, and that the Constitution's being pulled in to then protect those type of behaviors. I think probably a case in point of really recent stories, and I believe it was in Austin or Dallas, Texas. The Satan Club at an elementary school wants to have the same right to meet there as all other religious entities. And based on the equal, right, if you say the Constitution says that you should be free to practice your religion, if the people culturally accept Satanism as a allowable or permissible cultural or societal practice, then the Constitution is going to be pulled in to try to protect it. So that's a really great illustration right now of a story that's in the papers as of just 2 or 3 days ago. You can join my Telegram. I think my Telegram is, well, actually, I'll post a link to it, but Well-Mannered Monsters and I are getting synced up here, so that'll become a little bit more fluid in the future. But I try to post a lot of these stories into my Telegram because there's so much to discuss every day, and we can't discuss it all. Jenna Ellis, though, has this opinion that basically DeSantis has got involved, has the government basically trying to modify the behavior of a corporation is overstepping the government's bounds and therefore sets a dangerous precedent for other, let's say, state governors, state legislators, and state senates to follow the same behavior. But therein lies the problem I have with Jenna Ellis's opinion, and it's frankly that DeSantis threatened Disney. Basically, let's say it's day one. A bill was in the state Senate 2 or 3 days later. It was voted on the following day, sent to the House, and the House voted on it the following day. And under 7 days, it had gone from the Senate to the House to the governor's desk to be signed into law. And then Disney was stripped of its privileged status here in Florida. And to me, this is really remarkable. It does bespeak probably the will of the people. This may be what government should look like. The fact that it could so expeditiously move through a state Congress and then the state Senate and then, or excuse me, the state Senate and the state House get to the governor's desk all within 1 week of DeSantis calling for it really bespeaks the fact that the will of the people probably was aligned with this government behavior, and therefore government was doing precisely what it ought to be doing, which is representing and enacting what the people want. And believe me, all people, unless you're a mentally ill idiot, have zero interest in sexually grooming of little kids through what is one of the most insidious platforms out there, Disney, with all their underlying sexual faux pas, all their underlying disorientations and subtle sexual innuendos. I mean, Disney's been doing this for a long time, but basically they just broke out in the public and said, yeah, we've been trying to groom your kids, and we're going to continue grooming your kids, and we're going to make sure all of our employees basically follow our groomeristic policies. And so we're not going to back down on it. And the people in Florida said no, and the state government said no. So, and secondly, so if I was going to make a separate argument against Jenna Ellis here, it would be something like this. The will of the people, I believe, is being enacted. But even if that weren't the case, the elevation of Disney's privileged status as a corporation in Florida, in the context of other Florida corporations who have zero access to that level of tax and property privilege status, provides inequality amongst what's supposed to be a free market, provides a bit of a monopoly, a bit of benefit, certainly material difference in ability to have an edge against your competitors. And so in some sense, I see this as almost releveling the playing ground amongst these corporations in a way that brings it back to the equality it should have stayed in forever. So I'm not sure. So two things there. And here's the thing, don't cast out Jenna Ellis's concern outright, though. I think we need to handle that carefully, because it's not entirely wrong to say that we should be concerned about establishing precedent as people on the right of government getting involved and trying to control internal policies of a corporation, right? So and this is where we get into what is culturally allowable, what is culturally permissible will be decided by the people, and then the state government is supposed to enact that. And therein lies the challenge of parsing this out, of really having a clear position on it. because setting it could be a dangerous precedent. What if the state government becomes radical lefty loons and they now want to say that you can't have, and this has probably been going on for a long time actually, but you can't have any Christian policies. You're not allowed to have any, you're not allowed to choose your clientele based on certain moral categories. That could entirely happen. And then what DeSantis has done with Disney here could be cited as precedent, right? So you got to think long term here, but I don't think it will, because the case would have to be identical. You'd have to have such a massive amount of support amongst the people that it could pass through the House, the Senate, and get to the governor's desk and be signed into law really quickly for it to be able to occur in the same way that it just did with DeSantis. Really, I haven't seen laws pass through Senates like that, Congress like that in a long time. I mean, that was really quick. So, but this, going back to what I specialize in, which is worldview or underlying beliefs, I mean, that the big question is, what's the underlying beliefs of the people, their value set, and their virtues? And what DeSantis suggested got support for in both houses, the House and the Senate, and passed into law radically quickly, all provide evidence that this was the will of the people. This is what the people wanted. And it's easy to see why, because every government, there isn't, so people have this really confused, non-thoughtful way of thinking about the Constitution and what's allowable. America's the land of the free, but that doesn't mean free to behave in any way you want, obviously, because we still, or used to at least, we still do in the red states, the blue states are totally insane. We don't allow murderers to behave in the way that they wish, and behaviors, and somebody would say behaviors that aren't harmful to someone else. But of course, that brings in the gray area of harmful according to whose opinion. Somebody who's totally sold on the LGBTQ plus narrative is going to say treating them as unequal citizens is totally harmful, and therefore the right is being incredibly insensitive, incredibly unthoughtful, and incredibly unequal. They're being incredibly harsh, right? So, and they would say that the right's opinion that you shouldn't be able to have, let's say a man and a man can get married and get the same type of tax benefits that a traditional married couple can get. They're going to say, well, the right's opinion there that they don't want to allow that is harmful to me, and therefore the right's opinion should not be allowed, right? So you got to be real careful whenever you appeal to this idea of, America's the land of the free. Any behavior is acceptable and should be tolerated by society if it isn't harmful. Because really, that just reflects you haven't thought through it very well. Because if you had thought through it very well, you'd be asking the question, according to whom? That would be one of your first questions you would ask. Who is going to decide what's harmful and what's not harmful? And secondly, what's the threshold? So for instance, right now in my neighborhood, let's say you got multiple homosexual couples walking around with in vitro kids, and I have little kids and they're playing. That homosexual couple, before they maybe had children in vitro, they might say something like, well, when I say in vitro, I mean that's being carried by somebody else as well, obviously, at least in the case of men, right? So you look at this and you go, okay, well, they used to try to make the argument that, their love is theirs and it's their private business, etc. But the problem with that is that couples' behavior is never private. It's always one that's intermingled in the public. And so it's never this notion that it's, the whole notion that it's a private affair is just nonsense, right? When you actually look at what is accurate and actually describes what those behaviors are doing, it's never going to simply be private. My wife and I's relationship can never simply be private. That's absurd. Unless we would agree to never leave our household. But I don't think most couples are going to agree to that. But in this scenario now, you have a bunch of little kids that you're a mom and dad over, right? They like playing out the neighborhood. And now, my kids are going to have quite. And so remember, I don't have to take on anyone else's opinion. I believe a man and a woman is what I would call the moral and morally excellent sexual standard, and that the family life is the traditional family model is morally excellent. produces better results, right? We can make a pragmatic argument like that. We don't have to appeal to God or to the Bible. You can just simply make a pragmatic argument that the fruit produced, the effects produced from traditional family housing with the traditional family model produce very well-adjusted, wholesome people, right? So now I've got, if my kids though want to go out in the neighborhood and play, now I've got to explain why do they have a daddy and a daddy, and how could these be their kids without a mommy? And obviously, my 6-year-old riding her scooter around, I don't want her thinking about homosexuality, and I don't want her asking questions about, I don't want her asking questions about how could there be children without a mommy. Those are my, just so you know, I have a 6-year-old and younger children. They do not think about any of that. All of this narrative amongst the left is really exposing them as either pedos or groomers to a greater degree or lesser degree. Because postulating that 6-year-olds are thinking about any of that stuff is total nonsense. I have 3 kids, all 6 or under. Not one of them have ever asked me about anything sexual ever. So just based on my experience, and obviously my experience isn't universal, but the point is you get out what you put in, with an asterisk there, right? You always have to account for free will as they develop. You never know what's going to come out from their free will, but the point is that the equation, you get out what you get in. That's largely true, especially for younger children, because they are very law-like. You give them laws, and then as you train them in discernment and building habits as little kids, you give them ever greater degrees of freedom as you feel comfortable with their level of discernment and training, right? A lot of parents try to do it backwards. They try to make it really free and easy going when they're little, and then try to tighten up when they're teens, but that's playing the game backwards. You're not going to have success that way. Kids are just going to rebel, and they're going to have the capacity to rebel at that point and really make poor choices. So you gotta give them strict rules when they're young, strict laws when they're young, strict habits, and then you loosen up as they grow in wisdom, knowledge, discernment, and capacity. And that is, on a philosophical level, as an aside, that is a fundamental philosophical point. Freedom, degrees of freedom that can be used and can be wielded by somebody, is directly correlated to their development. This is why you might say something like God is a maximally free being, because he has capacities well beyond any creature, in which case his levels of freedom should be far beyond our levels of freedom. I can't flap my wings and fly, right? My arms are never going to let me fly. So back to DeSantis, though, I'm kind of getting a little far afield here with the philosophical discussion. I do not believe that DeSantis was out of line, and I actually believe that much of what DeSantis advocated for here was the will of the people. I believe that he was restored the corporate structure in Florida to a more equal playing field. I think that this discussion that Jenna Ellis raises about the concern of government interdiction on what a corporation's policy can be. And by the way, she doesn't exactly say that. I'm kind of interpreting her, so let me make sure I'm clear about that so I don't cause disrepute on her. But there's because Disney can still do whatever Disney wants. All that DeSantis and the people, let me reverse that actually. Disney can still have whatever internal policy they want. What the people are saying, and DeSantis, the state legislature, and the state house all agreed upon, was that the people, they represented the people, and the people decided that they didn't want Disney having any sort of corporate benefit beyond that of all the other corporations in the state, because they are taking on what I believe to be sexually predatory behaviors and policy. That's really what's happening here. When we say they're groomers, we're saying this institution, Disney, this corporation, Disney, is advancing, protecting, and defending behaviors that are sexually predatory on your children. And as I was saying earlier, little kids don't think about that stuff. My kids think about picking me a leaf and drawing flowers and reading pony pals and climbing on stuff. That's what little kids are interested in. They don't have any interest in race or sexuality or any of that stuff. And you know what? There's plenty of time in life for them to be interested in those things, to form an opinion on those things. And mommy and daddy at home ought to be the ones that are facilitating that. Big government be damned. And I think what Jenna Ellis is really worried about is that you would have big government interdiction on the policies of a corporation. If her concern is that, then I might say, okay, but what DeSantis did was set up a precedent that says you have privileged status in a red state, your corporation with privileged status in a red state, you better be very careful that you do what the people that compose and make that state red. Remember, it's not the other way. DeSantis, the Senate, and the House don't make the state red. The people make the state red, and then those representatives then enforce their will. And I think this is a remarkable and wonderful example of the government really a representative constitutional republic, and the state legislature and House in Florida working remarkably well, illustrating the power of the people and putting the left on the heels. But forever we ought to call, and I know many of you might want to go, my family wanted to go, etc. But the Magic Kingdom is now going to be known as the Groomer Kingdom going forward. And we ought to not let that die and be very careful about giving your dollars to them. I'm a hypocrite in this regard in some respects because I totally boycott a lot of big tech companies. But of course, I find myself or my wife using Amazon on occasion or what have you, right? So I know, so I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I am saying, if you have Disney Plus, cancel it. You don't really need that stuff. And what you really don't want to do, you need to be very careful with this, parents. You want to dissuade your children from having interest in anything related to Disney. I know the princesses are wonderful and all that, but you got to remember, the more you associate pleasure and enjoyment and imply, therefore, that there's safety with Disney products, the more open your child might be as they grow older to Disney and see Disney in a favorable light. I recently told my kids that Disney was an evil corporation, and they don't understand any of this at this point, but I just had to tell them, I said, well, we're not going to be buying that stuff, and, we're going to kind of move away from that because when you get older, I just thought when you get older, you understand, but my oldest, she's 6, she does have a little idea of what evil is. So they're an evil corporation, and mommy and daddy want you to just stay away from it. And, let's keep it moving. There's plenty of other options out there. There's woods, there's forests, there's flowers, there's arts and crafts, so many other things that our children can be involved in other than sitting them in front of groomers, essentially. And groomers that have exposed themselves, defended themselves, and berated parents for how dare you question us wanting to groom your children. That's where we're at. We need to recognize that. Well, friends, it's about time for me to sign off here. I really appreciate you listening. I hope this this first episode of Well-Mannered Monsters Podcast 1.1 with me, your co-host, Dr. Scalise, is received well. Bravo to DeSantis, down with Disney, and I hope you have a wonderful day. This is brought to you by Black Tulip Studios. Thanks for your time.